Let's start with what's happening right now, because it's hard to believe. Trump is out on stage, pounding his chest, declaring that he's standing firm against China, that he's fighting Beijing head-on. But behind closed doors, the reality looks very different. He's pleading with China to keep sending critical goods to the United States. Think about that for a moment, announcing a trade war, while at the same time relying on your opponent for rare earths magnets and components that American industry simply can't function without. And yet, even as he makes those requests, he's threatening to slap a 200% tariff on those very same products if the shipments stop. It doesn't end there. America's dollar, long branded the world's reserve currency, is slipping from its pedestal. Not long ago, global investors were willing to pay a premium just to hold it. Now the tide is turning, demand is fading, confidence is cracking, and the day may come when markets treat dollars like a burden, something you need to be paid to take off the books. A currency that once symbolized power is becoming something investors are trying to move away from. That's the fragile state of America's financial foundation. On the other side of the equation, Beijing is strengthening the yuan and tightening control over the U.S. assets it holds. This shift leaves Washington in a weaker position during tariff negotiations. America can talk tough, but the risks are heavy and the leverage is slipping, so buckle up. In this breakdown, we'll uncover how Trump's strategy has boxed America into a corner, how China is quietly gaining ground, and why the weakening dollar could set off the next global financial crisis. Hit like, subscribe, and let's dive in. Trump's desperation to keep Chinese exports flowing into the United States has never been clearer. Recently, he issued a stark warning. If China dares to cut off magnet exports, Washington will respond with a 200% tariff. 200%. A tax at that level wouldn't just hurt. It would wipe out margins, shut down trade flows, and rattle markets across the globe. That threat came right after his meeting with South Korea's president, a moment that revealed more fear than strength. Experts point out that this wasn't confidence. It was a signal that Trump knows he's losing leverage in this fight. Now, some might assume the U.S. could weather such a storm, but that assumption falls apart the moment you look at the numbers. China controls around 90% of the world's rare earth magnet supply, and their dominance isn't just about digging minerals out of the ground. They control refining, processing, the advanced technology, and even the patents. That means, without Chinese cooperation, America's supply chains don't just slow down, they fracture completely. Still, Trump tries to project strength, claiming that the U.S. has bigger muscles. He even hinted that he could ground Chinese planes by cutting off Boeing parts, only to backtrack and say he wouldn't because the relationship was great. That's less a show of power than a balancing act on a rope that's already fraying, suspended over the collapse of America's own supply system. Meanwhile, behind the speeches, Washington is scrambling to build an alternative. The administration has started pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into domestic rare earth projects, backing companies like MP Materials, Neocorp, and USA Rare Earth. These firms are being propped up with loans, guaranteed purchase contracts, and government-set price floors. Officials have even called it a Manhattan Project for rare earths, signaling just how desperate the situation has become. Congress and the Pentagon have committed billions more to securing supply lines. They're eyeing new mining opportunities in Greenland and the Democratic Republic of Congo. A 10-year deal is already in place to ship Greenland's heavy rare earths to a Defense Department-backed facility in Louisiana for processing. But here's the reality. Despite all that money and effort, the U.S. is nowhere near producing enough to replace Chinese supply. Industry insiders warned that America is still years away from meeting even a fraction of its demand. Until then, the gap has to be filled by Beijing. There's no way around it, and the markets are already reacting. Stock futures have dipped, signaling unease. At the same time, Trump abruptly fired a Federal Reserve governor, officially on grounds of fraud, but in reality to tighten his control over monetary policy, just as economic uncertainty grows. This fight isn't happening in some abstract world of policy papers. It touches daily life. The rare earth magnets at the center of this battle power your smartphone, your electric car, advanced medical equipment, and even defense systems. If the supply falters, assembly lines grind to a halt, prices shoot up, and the economy spirals toward chaos. So, here's the question. How secure do you feel knowing that the materials linking modern technology to everyday life are concentrated in China's hands, while the US is left threatening its supplier? It's a dangerous game, and the stakes couldn't be higher, but magnets are only one piece of the puzzle. China has more moves lined up, and they go far beyond rare earths. Let's walk through what Beijing just rolled out, because it reshapes the field again. On Friday, China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology introduced a fresh set of rules for rare earths. These don't stop at ore dug up inside China. They also cover materials sent into China for processing. That matters because China isn't only a major miner, it's the world's central processor. The place where raw material turns into usable metals, oxides, and the high-spec inputs that modern industry needs. Under the new framework, firms face strict production quotas, formal approvals, and detailed reporting on volumes moved. Miss the requirements and penalties follow. Future quotas can be cut. In practice, Beijing now decides who gets access, how much flows, and when shipments move. All of this arrives as the United States is already scrambling to secure enough supply to keep factories and defense production on schedule. Why now? Washington has tightened restrictions on Chinese access to advanced technology. In April, after President Trump broadened tariffs across multiple trade partners, Beijing widened its own, permitting to 7 additional rare earth minerals, citing national security and misuse risks. The sequence wasn't accidental. It answered pressure with control. Look at the U.S. position. In 2024, roughly 70% of America's rare earth input came directly from China. Additional volumes arrived from Malaysia, Japan, and Estonia. But much of that material still originated in China or passed through Chinese refineries, even when the label says somewhere else. China often sits in the middle of the chain. At home, Beijing is also shutting down leaks. In July, the Ministry of State Security launched a crackdown on smuggling, classifying it as a national security issue. That tells you how central this sector has become. No gray channels, no informal exports, only state-managed flows. Abroad, China is extending reach at the source. Across Africa, Chinese companies are signing mining deals, financing projects, and locking in long-term offtake. Reported investment in African mining has crossed $10 billion. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, and Botswana are key nodes. In the DRC, Chinese firms already dominate cobalt, crucial for EV batteries. By comparison, U.S. investments in African critical minerals in 2023 were only about $300 million. One side is building end-to-end control. The other is still laying groundwork, and Africa holds nearly 30% of global reserves for these materials. So influence there shapes the future of clean energy, electronics, and defense. Put the pieces together. At home, China is tightening quotas and enforcement. In processing, it keeps the choke points. Overseas, it buys stakes at the mines. That two-track approach, domestic control plus external securing of supply, leaves Washington. With fewer options, could the U.S. catch up? Not quickly. Mines take years to develop. Refineries take capital, expertise, and environmental approvals. Communities debate projects. Politics adds delay. Meanwhile, the world still needs finished magnets, alloying agents, and refined oxides today, not in 5 or 7 years. So, the immediate risk is straightforward. If Beijing slows exports or redirects supply, U.S. manufacturers feel the hit fast. Delays in electronics, higher EV costs, pressure on defense contractors. By writing the rules at home and stitching together supply abroad, China keeps leverage squarely on its side. Tariffs can change prices at the border. They don't create minerals, refineries, or processing know-how. Until those exist at scale, outside China, Washington can raise duties, but it can't conjure a supply chain it doesn't control. Now, let's shift to the financial front, because it connects directly to China's grip on rare earths. While the U.S. dollar is sliding, Beijing has moved in the opposite direction, choosing to strengthen the yuan. That decision rattled markets, since the rule of thumb is that export-driven economies keep their currencies weak to protect competitiveness. But China holds advantages the U.S. doesn't: steady access to cheap Russian energy, reliable supplies of raw materials, and an expanding lock on critical minerals. With those foundations, Beijing can afford to lift the yuan without wrecking its export machine. This week, China's central bank made its boldest move in months. It fixed the yuan at 7.1 per dollar, the strongest setting since early November and the sharpest upward adjustment since January. The timing was calculated. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell had just signaled that rate cuts were likely coming in September, a dovish stance that immediately sent the dollar tumbling. Beijing seized the moment and countered with a stronger yuan. The impact was immediate. Offshore trading pushed the yuan to its best performance since July. This wasn't just a technical adjustment. It was Beijing showing that it can set the tempo in currency markets, turning what looked like a U.S. opening into a stage for its own strength. What does this mean in practical terms? The yuan is climbing while the dollar is losing ground. Each percentage point the yuan rises tends to lift Chinese equities by about 3%. So Beijing isn't only shoring up its currency, it's also channeling global capital into Shanghai and Shenzhen. For investors, that makes Chinese markets look like havens of stability. At the very moment Americans are squeezed by higher prices from tariffs and a weakening dollar. Now, take a look at the dollar itself. For decades, it served as the bedrock of global finance, the unquestioned reserve currency. That picture is changing fast. Rate cuts are undermining its yield advantage. U.S. debt levels are ballooning, and the scarcity that once made dollars valuable is eroding. Analysts are now entertaining scenarios once unthinkable. A world where investors need incentives to hold dollars. Not because of strength, but because demand is evaporating. Treasuries highlight the strain. Just paying interest on us debt now costs $1.2 trillion a year. Instead of clamoring for more, foreign buyers are stepping back. Into that vacuum have stepped financial insiders with unusual ideas, proposals to tie stablecoins to treasury bonds as a way of keeping demand alive. Scott Bessant, a well-known strategist, has been one of the loudest voices pushing this concept. That momentum even helped drive passage of the new stablecoin bill. But pause on what that says. When the U.S. government leans on crypto investors to support its borrowing, it doesn't inspire confidence. It raises alarms. A country that once funded itself with ease is now searching for unconventional lifelines. And for the world's largest economy, that shift looks less like adaptation and more like desperation. Meanwhile, tariffs are pressing down on Americans from every direction. On paper, they redesigned to shield domestic industries. In reality, the average U.S. tariff now sits near 17%, covering everything from electronics to industrial components. The result is higher costs across the board. Factories pay more for parts. Consumers pay more for finished products. And even the raw materials that businesses rely on come with a bigger price tag. Instead of relief, tariffs have layered another source of inflation onto an already fragile economy. Now add the falling dollar. When your currency weakens, imports become even more expensive. Put the two together, tariffs and a sinking dollar, and the U.S. is stuck in a painful loop. Prices rise from both ends, while the supposed protection for American industries never truly arrives. Supply chains are still controlled abroad, and domestic producers don't feel insulated from competition. This trap is visible everywhere. Manufacturers complain that their margins are shrinking. Consumers see prices climbing faster than wages. Businesses that once counted on global networks now face uncertainty with every shipment. Anger is building, but solutions are scarce. And this is the bigger picture. An economy weighed down by tariffs, pressured by a weakening currency, and caught in supply chains it doesn't control. That combination leaves Washington short of tools, and Americans paying the price. The world is shifting quickly, and these shifts aren't slowing down. That's why we track them here, so you can see the storm building before it hits. Make sure you resubscribed, because the next phase of this struggle will determine not just trade balances, but the shape of the global financial